So, hello again. Good to see you again. And today is our first full class. Last time we spent a lot of time talking about the syllabus, but we also talked about some unusual features of financial markets that make financial markets a little different from just a typical market where you can think simply in terms of demand and supply. Hello, Lisa. So what I want to do today is talk about those factors. So I'm going to switch to the whiteboard, and we'll talk about oh, this isn't working. Let me see. Great, it works. This is my first time using the whiteboard from Blackboard. So we're going to talk about certain factors that affect financial markets as opposed to other markets. And we may remember from last time, if not, we'll go over them again. One of them was the idea that because in any financial transaction, let's say a loan, there's a time passing between the first moment when the transaction starts, let's say the moment when you lend me money, and the moment when the transaction ends, which is when I pay you back. And that means that in between those two dates, uncertainty may emerge. And we discussed on Monday that there are, two forms of uncertainty to keep in mind. One is what I called risk, which I guess we could define as unforeseen things could happen. And by this I mean things that are completely outside of your control. So, for example, last class we were discussing an example of why I might be wanting to borrow money. Maybe I'm borrowing money because I'm going to start a restaurant and I need the funds to get the business up and running. Suppose that I started a restaurant in January of 2020, thinking that I would fill my tables with lots of hungry customers, not realizing that 2 months later, the economy would shut down and people would no longer be interested in dining out. So that was an example of what I'm calling risk. It's just a factor completely outside of my control. And even if I had an excellent business plan for my restaurant, this risk means that in spite of my best efforts, I may not be able to pay back the loan that you gave me to start my restaurant. But there's another form of uncertainty that's much more interesting, and we defined it last class. We called it asymmetric information. And this has to do with uncertainty that doesn't arise outside of the contract, but arises, in a sense, as a result of the contract, or it has to do with uncertainty among the people involved in the transactions. Asymmetric information would suggest that, right? The word asymmetric meaning suggesting that there's some information that one of the people in the transaction has that the other one doesn't, but would probably like. So today we're going to spend the class talking about asymmetric information. And asymmetric information comes in two flavors. So there are two types of asymmetric information, and it's going to be important to be able to tell the two apart. Okay. Now, the first kind of asymmetric information might be the fact that once you've lent me the money, you can't necessarily see what I'm going to do with it, right? It may be that, for example, that restaurant that I told you I was going to start isn't actually what I'm going to do with the money. Or maybe I do use the money in the way that I told you, but then I slack off and don't work very hard, and so I end up not being able to repay you. That effort, of course, is something that I choose, the borrower, but you, the lender, may be unable to easily see what I'm actually doing. So it's not random events that are outside of our control. My effort is totally under my control and has a big impact on whether or not I'm able to pay you back. So an example like that is the type of asymmetric information that we call moral hazards. And one way people try and remember what moral hazard is as opposed to other types of asymmetric information is that this comes up after the contract is signed. And it usually has some kind of flavor of this example where whether I'm able to pay you back depends on whether I do some kind of effort, but I may not have incentives to make that effort once the contract has been signed. An example from real life as opposed to from financial markets. Well, financial markets are real too, but an example that might be more familiar, I guess, of asymmetric, of moral hazard, sorry, is to do with car insurance. So I'm sure all of you in the United States, by the time you reach college, most of you have learned to drive. So again, this is something that hopefully is in your experience. And in order to learn to drive, well, in order to drive, you need a driver's license, you need a vehicle, but you also need car insurance, vehicle insurance. Right? And vehicle insurance is supposed to help you deal with the costs of an accident in case it occurs, right? Now, to some extent, car accidents are forms of risk, right? They're things that are outside of your control, right? For example, you might get into an accident because other people around you are bad drivers, right? Or because the road was icy or something. You could think of that as risk. But a big factor in whether or not you get into a car accident, of course, is how well are you driving? And now imagine you have two drivers, one who has car insurance and the other one who doesn't. Which driver is going to drive the best? Or to make it more obviously an economic decision, which driver has the incentive to drive really carefully? The one who has insurance or the one who doesn't? Clearly, the one who doesn't have insurance has an incentive to drive more carefully, because if they get into an accident, there's no one to pick up the cost. So what does it mean? It means that as soon as you agree to sign a contract for car insurance, your incentive to actually avoid car accidents goes down, making accidents more likely. And so that is an example of moral hazard that hopefully is familiar and easily understood. Where does moral hazard possibly show up in financial markets? I can think of several examples, but here's another one that might have been familiar to you, to the extent that you've been taking economics classes. So When you took macro in particular, you probably discussed at some point or another how 10, 12 years ago, there was a very serious financial crisis in the United States that led to an economic crisis as well. And you may have read that, well, it had a lot to do with the housing market and so on. So we'll talk about the housing market a bit later. But at the time, one of the things that was happening is that a lot of very large companies, some were very large banks, but not all of them, I think very large car companies like General Motors were also in very serious trouble at the time. And some of those companies are so large that if they were to fail, if they were to get into serious trouble, they would have a impact on lots of people. Let's say on, well, all the people that work in the areas where the car company is based, or if a bank shuts down, it could affect all the people that are borrowing from that bank or lending to that bank. So those very large companies are sometimes known as too big to fail. Because they're so large, if they ever were to get in trouble, the government might find itself under pressure to use taxpayer money to support those companies. Now, I'm going to argue that if companies are too big to fail, that's an example of moral hazard as well. If I'm a really large company and I realize I'm so large that I'm too big to fail, the government is going to be heavily pressured to bail me out if I ever get in trouble, what should I rationally do? Well, the rational thing for me to do is to take a lot of risk and do a lot of risky projects. If they succeed, I'll make tons of money. If they fail, it's all right. If I get in trouble, I know the government is going to bail me out. So there's no formal insurance contract there, but it ends up being the same as if there were, because you know implicitly the government is going to insure you if you get in trouble, and that means there's a moral hazard situation there as well. Large companies have an incentive to take undue risks, knowing that if things go wrong, yeah, taxpayers will pick up the tab. Of course, the question is, how do we deal with moral hazard if it's something that's always going to be there whenever a borrower has an incentive not to go through with the effort that is required or with the actions that are required? Well, one obvious reason why moral hazard occurs is because the lender can't see, or the insurer can't see what the other party is doing. Right? If they could monitor the borrower, then that would take care of this problem at least to some extent, right? In the example of car insurance, amazingly, there actually is monitoring technology now, because you can, if you have certain insurance companies will give you an app that you can use in your phone, and thus sending information to your insurer whether you're driving safely. Are you driving under the speed limits? Are you driving too fast? And so they actually can monitor you to some extent. That's one way to deal with moral hazard. Another way to deal with, actually another example of monitoring is the following. Have you heard of a hedge fund? So a hedge fund is, imagine it's a bit like a bank. So it takes money from individuals and then uses that money to buy different kinds of assets to try and generate profits. But hedge funds usually have a very small number of very, very wealthy clients. Okay? So a friend of mine who I went to university with, for example, finished university and then went to work for a company called Zip Brothers. And Zip Brothers is a hedge fund that manages the money that belongs to the Zip brothers, the two of them. Right? Although it has a lot of money, it actually belongs to only a couple of people. So those hedge funds will have a manager, and the manager has a lot of responsibility, right? Their decisions make or lose all this money for these Zip brothers. And so the Zip brothers may want to monitor that person. And it's not unusual for hedge funds to literally hire private investigators to follow around the hedge fund managers to make sure that they're not in any sort of trouble that might affect their performance. So monitoring is one way to try and deal with moral hazard. Another example is, you may have heard of venture capital. So venture capital firms are firms who specialize in finding entrepreneurs and giving them money so that they can pursue their new business. But venture capital firms don't just give money to the entrepreneur once they figured out that this is probably a good business plan. Very often what they'll do is they'll say, first of all, here's the money that you need to start your company. But in addition, one of us from the venture capital firm will become your partner. And so, of course, now we're not only monitoring because we're in the firm looking around and seeing what's going on, we even have some decision power that we've taken away from you or are sharing with you. So that's another way of trying to get around the moral hazard problem, which is by sharing the decision power. That doesn't work very well in the case of car insurance, but it does make sense when we're thinking about things like starting new business projects. Any questions or thoughts so far about all of this? No, great. Now, here is one more example. Well, another example, I guess, is obviously just have laws and regulations that punish certain behavior, right? If I get into a car crash because I did something really stupid, then I might get in trouble with the law. So that's an example of additional ways in which moral hazard can be dealt with. But there's one more that has to do with finance that I think is very important in understanding one of the facts that we discussed last Monday. And I'm going to just tell you what the idea is first. I'm then going to try and persuade you that this is true. Remember that there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of contracts that there could be, two kinds of assets, I guess, based on how the payments are structured. One is what we called debt, which generally means that there are fixed payments. The other is called equity. And in the case of equity, the key idea here is that instead of you getting fixed payments, instead, if you're the lender, instead what you get is some share of the profits of my venture, whatever it is, of my enterprise. I'm going to argue that having debt as opposed to equity contracts is a way of trying to get around certain kinds of moral hazard problems. How does that relate to what we discussed on Monday? Well, one of the things that we discussed on Monday is that debt contracts are much more widely available, certainly to people like you and me. It would be really hard for me to raise money to do anything by trying to issue shares. Whereas on the other hand, if I wanted to borrow money to start a company, to buy a house, to send my kids to college, getting a loan, which is a form of debt, isn't as hard. I'm going to argue that the reason is because debt actually is one way of dealing with moral hazard problems. To see that, I'm going to need to clear this board. So there we go. And let's switch to black. So the fact that we start with, the observation is that debt is more common than equity. One question is why, and I'm going to argue is that debt is one way to avoid moral hazard. Now, to see this, we need to think of a moral hazard problem. And let's go back to the example of me starting a restaurant. And I need some money from you. I need to borrow money from you so that I can get my restaurant started up. Now, a key factor in whether or not my restaurant succeeds is going to be how much effort I put into it. Okay? So let's imagine that if I work really hard in my restaurant, I make this much profits. This is what I get if I work hard. But if I don't work hard, then the profits are much smaller. This is what happens if I'm lazy. Of course, in order for the business to succeed, if you're lending money to me, you probably want me to work hard, right? Now imagine that I borrow money from you and I borrowed it with an equity contract. What happens here? Well, the difference between me working hard and me being lazy is this much, right? That's how much difference it makes whether I work hard or lazy, or I'm lazy. Now the gain, which is this difference, if we have an equity contract, is going to be shared between you and me, right? That's the whole essence of equity. So my incentive to work hard isn't going to be this difference. What I get if I work hard is not this difference. It's only a fraction of it, because part of this difference would go to you with an equity contract. So in a sense, the equity contract is kind of diluting, weakening my incentive to work hard. But now instead, let's suppose that I'm borrowing from you using a debt contract. You're giving me a loan, and so what I have to pay you back. So now let's imagine that there's a debt contract. I'm going to promise you a fixed payment next year in exchange for you giving me a loan now. So now let's represent that here. So if I work hard, I have to repay, let's say, this much. If I'm lazy, well, doesn't matter. I still have to repay you this much, right? And now, in this case with debt, the difference between what I get if I work hard and what I get if I'm lazy entirely goes to me. So whereas in the equity contract case, some of these gains would be shared with you, in the case of debt, the entire gains go to me. So my incentive to work hard is greater when I have a debt contract. And so that's the sense in which debt might be one way to try and step around moral hazard problems. Okay. Any questions or thoughts about this? No? Okay, great. Wondering I should say this. I guess no, that's fine. So we've looked at moral hazard, which was one kind of asymmetric information problem. And we looked at some examples from the real world, let's say, like car insurance. We also looked at an example from several examples from finance, too big to fail and debt versus equity. Here's an application of this idea, by the way. I remember 4 years ago, there was a presidential election, and the Republican, there were, I don't know, 15 different Republican candidates trying to become the nominee for the Republican Party. And I remember one of them had a plan for trying to support people going to college by having them borrow, not with debt, which is the way it normally happens, but with basically equity contracts. So instead of paying back some fixed interest over the years once you finish college, you would pay back some percentage of your income. What is this idea telling us? Well, if what happens to you after college, your income after college depends on things like how hard you study, then trying to fund college with equity contracts is actually going to discourage people from studying, right? Because the extra effort that they do ends up benefiting somebody else, at least to some extent. So that's an interesting thing that came up in the education plan of one of, I think it was Marco Rubio who had that idea. I guess he didn't take a financial economics class. So, any questions, thoughts, comments? All right, so that was all number one, moral hazard. Now let's move on to number two. The second type of asymmetric information problem that we can look at is what's known as adverse selection. And remember I said that in some sense moral hazard is an asymmetric information problem that arises after the contract has been signed, maybe even as a result of the contract having been signed. Adverse selection can be thought of as an asymmetric information problem that arises before the contract is signed. And it appears in situations where the buyer, there's something that a buyer wants to buy, but it is available in good and bad versions, let's say. So there is an asset, or good, there is a thing that, we could just say broadly, could be good or bad, or comes in good and bad versions. So the first element is that we need there to be something that could be good quality or bad quality. It could be an asset, it could be a good. And the key element, which is what makes this asymmetric information, is that the buyer can't tell the difference, at least not at first. But the seller can. So again, going back to starting from the real world rather than financial markets, let's give an example of what adverse selection might look like. before we talked about car insurance for moral hazard, there's actually something about the car industry that works for adverse selection as well, and that is the second-hand car market. So, have any of you seen the movie or read the book Matilda by chance? By Roald Dahl? You have? So, several of you have. So, does anyone remember what the father of Matilda does in that book or movie? Sarah Marie, do you remember?
He sells used cars.
He sells used cars. And what does he do to them before he sells them?
He tries to increase their value, so he'll like try to super glue the bumper on if it's falling off, or will dial back the number of miles that are on the odometer to make the cars look more valuable.
See this junker? I paid $100 for her. She's got 120,000 miles on her. Transmission shot, bumpers have fallen off. What do I do with her? I sell her.
Excellent, indeed. He cheats, right? He takes cars that are garbage. He tries to make them look better, but he doesn't actually fix them, right? The cars are still not good, not in good shape, but he tries to sell them as though they were so he can increase their value. So that's a clear example of adverse selection, right? There could be good cars out there on the second-hand market, and we know there are bad ones as well, but it may be very hard for the buyer to tell. The seller knows it's a bad car, and so they will try and pass it off, but they may try and pass off a bad car as a good one because the buyer can't tell the difference. And this is something that happens in the movie, but it also happens in real life. You've probably heard about Hurricane Katrina, which hit the Gulf Coast, caused huge amounts of damage in Louisiana and Mississippi mainly, I think. Killed thousands of people. It's a disaster. And of course, it flooded large areas of those states, which means that a lot of the vehicles in those areas were underwater. And then a few years later, all those rusted vehicles started showing up in other parts of the country on the second-hand car market. But the paperwork had been faked so that it looked like they hadn't been involved in Katrina at all. So this is a problem that affects the second-hand car market in reality, not just in fiction. So that's an example from real life. What's an example from financial markets? Well, remember earlier I suggested that on and off we may find ourselves talking about the events surrounding the financial crisis from 10, 12 years ago, because, well, it just turns out that a lot of what happened there has to do with adverse selection and moral hazard. I want to talk about something that's called a mortgage-backed security. Turns out a mortgage-backed security is a lot like a used car. So, first of all, a mortgage, as you probably know, is just a loan that's used to buy a house. So, I have a mortgage on the house that I'm sitting in right now. It means that in order to buy this house, I went to a bank and I said, can you please lend me so much money? They said yes, and now I'm paying them fixed payments over the next 30 years. So that's a mortgage. And of course, there's always some risk that some of the mortgages that a bank makes won't be paid. People may strategically stop paying their mortgages, or they may stop paying their mortgages because they've lost their jobs. But over a large number of mortgages, right, you would think that actually doesn't really matter. Let's say, suppose you know that 2% of the mortgages are going to default, but if you made 1,000 mortgages, then the uncertainty over the whole group of them is kind of gone. It's like, imagine you flip a coin, you get heads, you win, tails, you lose. Then you're experiencing some randomness, right? But if you flip 1,000 coins, you know what's going to happen almost for sure. Half of them will be heads, half will be tails, and you're not actually experiencing uncertainty, right? So that's where mortgage-backed securities come in. What they are is, imagine you take a bank that issued 1,000 mortgages, and then they just pack them all together and sell them to someone else as an asset, a new kind of financial asset. So now that other person collects all the payments on this group of 1,000 mortgages. Now, suppose I'm the bank that originated, that first gave out those 1,000 mortgages. Well, I know exactly who those people are, right? Who borrowed, because I gave them the mortgage. But when I then went and sold off the 1,000 mortgages to someone else, they don't have that kind of detailed information that I do about exactly what is in this mortgage-backed security. So this kind of sounds like it's asking for trouble, right? These are mortgages packed together. And the seller of this pack of mortgages knows what they are, but the other one doesn't. And now, what happens in 2008 is suddenly people realized, well, first it started with house prices collapsing, a lot of people losing their jobs, and suddenly a lot of people, more people than usual, not being able to pay their mortgages. The problem then suddenly becomes, if you bought one of these mortgage-backed securities, now that the housing market is collapsing and tons of people can't pay their mortgages, now suddenly it really matters exactly which mortgages you bought. Mortgages from, let's say, Fairfax County, Virginia, which is not far from here. I heard something like 40% of mortgages defaulted, which is a huge amount, right? Mortgages where I'm in Bethesda, Maryland right now, there were no defaults really, or nothing unusual rather, compared to normal times. So suddenly you find yourself in this situation again, where there are some mortgage-backed securities, packages of mortgages that are good because people aren't defaulting, and so they're worth a lot. Let's just make up a number. Let's say the good one is worth $1 million. But there are also these bad versions. Let's say the Fairfax County mortgage-backed security. And just to make things simple, let's just say that they're worthless. They're worth $0. And the key problem is, you can't tell which is which. Now imagine the situation. You're an investor, you're looking to buy some kinds of financial assets so that you can try and get some profits, and you come across someone who offers you a mortgage-backed security. Now, you know the good ones are good, they're worth $1 million because they're not going to default, and the bad ones are really bad. In this simple example, they're worthless. And the one that's being offered to you, you can't tell the difference, right? So how much will you pay mortgage-backed security that I'm offering you? Are you going to pay $1 million? No, right? You're not sure it's worth $1 million, so you would never pay that much. You pay something in between, depending on, I guess, how likely you think it is that the one in front of you is good or bad. Now think about that. Now think about this from the seller's perspective. The seller, he or she, knows if the thing is good or bad. If they had any good ones and they tried to sell it to you, they would only be able to sell it for I don't know, 500,000 or something in between, right? Because you're not sure if it's good or bad. That means if I were a seller and I had good and bad ones, it would make no sense for me to try and sell the good ones, because I'm never going to be able to sell them for what they're worth. I should just keep them and earn those $1 million from the mortgages. What does that mean? It means that in this situation with adverse selection, where the buyers can't tell if the good assets or the bad assets are in front of them, it means only the bad assets are going to be traded. The good ones can never be sold at full value, so you won't sell them. You'll hold on to them and only sell the bad ones. And in a situation like this, if the bad ones are really bad, the market can just shut down, right? No point in having a market for assets that don't give you anything. And this is kind of what happened in 2008. Suddenly people panicked. They realized that not all the mortgage-backed securities were equal. Some of them were a lot worse than they thought they were, but they couldn't tell which were the good ones and which were the bad ones. And so what happens is the market just collapsed, because the good ones are going to hold on to them. That means only the bad ones are being traded. How was it solved? The way it was solved is by the government essentially coming in, buying huge amounts of these mortgage-backed securities, and then carefully going through to figure out, is this one good, is this one bad, and so on. And then they sold them all at the correct value. And then, now that we knew which was good and which was bad, the adverse selection problem was gone, and the market started up again, and everything started working again. Okay, so that's adverse selection. It's when there's an asset or an object that comes in good and bad versions, whether it's used cars full of sawdust as opposed to good cars, or whether it's mortgage-backed securities. If the buyer can't tell which is which, then things can devolve to the situation where the market just shuts down. Any questions, thoughts about this? Okay, so we've just said that in financial markets there are two very serious problems. Well, there's risk, but then there's asymmetric information, and the two important kinds of asymmetric information, there's moral hazard and adverse selection, and both of them stem from a lack of information by one or other party in a contract. Now, in economics, whenever there's a need for something, you would say, well, you think, well, why isn't there just a business that starts up to try and meet that need? If there's moral hazard or adverse selection in the world because people lack information about what their counterparties are doing, why don't we just have a market for information? Why don't businesses start up to try and provide that information? And of course, so let's start a new slide and ask that question. Why might it be hard to sustain a market for information? I mean, there is a market for information, but wherever there is a market for information, there's certain obstacles that are going to have to be dealt with. Sorry about that. That should be an I. That should be an O. The problem with the whiteboard is it doesn't allow me to erase just one thing. I can either erase everything or nothing. It's a bit annoying, but so far it's working okay. There's a key feature of information, or maybe more broadly, knowledge, which is that information and knowledge unlike other goods, these things are what's called non-rival. Have you heard of this concept before? What it means is the following. This green tea here is a rival good. Right? If I'm drinking it, there's no way anyone else can. Right? Physically, it's impossible for two people to use this at the same time. But knowledge is different. If I know something, that doesn't stop you knowing the same thing, right? That's what education is all about. I'm trying to share with you my knowledge and some information. We can all know the same thing at the same time. And that turns out to be a problem because let's use an example from, actually this is arguably a financial asset. Suppose I want to generate some new knowledge. Let's say I'm going to try and come up with a new and better smartphone. So I have to invest a huge amount of money trying to generate this new knowledge, right, for how to do this thing, this new thing better than before. And in order to do that, well, I have to spend a huge amount of resources and time, and I succeeded, and now I've come out with my new smartphone. There's nothing, or rather, there's nothing except maybe the legal system to stop you buying the first new smartphone that I came up with, taking it apart, and making your copies of it. And you can make it much cheaper than I can, right? Because you didn't have to spend all the money trying to generate this new knowledge. So that's an example for R&D, right? Research and development, trying to come up with new knowledge to make a new product. But in financial markets, the same problem is going to be there. For example, suppose there are these good assets and these bad assets, right? And I decide I'm going to start a company to try and sell the good asset, to try and figure out which are the good assets and which are the bad assets, and then I'm going to sell them to people, or share that or sell that information to people. The problem is, of course, if I sell that information to you about which ones are the good ones and the bad ones, well, now you know. Even worse, there could be third people, other parties, who observe, oh, Professor Samaniego has sold information to Tai, and now we see that Tai is out there buying this particular kind of asset, so we know that that must be the good one. And so this is an example of a broad problem that comes up in the economics of information and knowledge, which is called the free rider problem. That someone has to come up with the information in the first place, but once that information has been generated, if other people can access it, then they can benefit from it, which means that the person who actually invested in it can't profit from their investment. Okay, so how do we get around the free rider problem? It's going to be hard, right? One way in which we could get around is, what if there isn't anyone out there who can copy? In other words, maybe it means that the market for information is what in micro you would have called a natural monopoly, where there would only be a few very large players. In the other class, someone pointed out that in the case of financial assets, there is kind of a market for information, and that there are these large credit rating agencies that say, okay, the shares from this company, we're going to rate them AAA, which means that they're very good quality, very safe. This company is likely to be very profitable. These other assets over here, they are AA. It's a good company, but not quite as good as the other one. So they rate different kinds of loans or bonds or shares based on how profitable or risky and so on they think they are. But there are very few credit rating agencies. So maybe the reason is because there's the problem of the free rider problem, and having large players overcomes that. There was, I guess it's not so popular now, but many years ago there used to be something called the microcredit markets. This was a very popular idea in developing economies where there's a bank that might give money. There was a famous bank that started this called Grameen. They would give money to, not to individuals, but to groups of people, and the group had to pay back. And the idea was that to try and get over moral hazard and adverse selection, is imagine something like if one person defaults, then everyone defaults, and then everyone gets punished for what the one person did. So they had an incentive to watch each other and make sure that everyone was behaving well, and so they were able to pay back what they'd been lent. This was microcredit to small farmers or small businessmen. It started in Bangladesh. What happened is that after a few years, the commercial banks realized, oh, this village is paying back their loans. We can see that, and this other village isn't. Therefore, we already have the knowledge. We can free ride on what Grameen Bank did. We know the village over here is well behaved, so we'll lend to people there. We know this village over here isn't so well behaved, so we won't. And they could do that on terms that were much more attractive than Grameen Bank, because of course they didn't need to pay the costs of figuring out which is the right village and so on. So that's another example of free rider problem in financial markets. Any questions, thoughts, doubts about this? Okay. So finally, if you look at the textbook, it says that there is a third thing that is unusual about financial markets, which affects the shape of financial markets, which it calls transaction costs. That trying to buy and sell financial assets may involve costs that don't appear in other markets. Now, I would argue that many of the transaction costs that are important here are precisely the costs of generating the information. So the textbook calls it a separate factor that shapes financial markets. We can think of it that way, or again, we can just remember that many of these transaction costs are just the costs that make asymmetric information such a problem in the first place. So we don't need to have a long discussion about that right now. Okay. So ready? Here comes the first question. And use your phone to press the correct button. Borrowers and lenders interact without intermediaries in primary markets, direct markets, secondary markets, or indirect markets. Which is the correct answer? Someone is thinking. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There. The answer was direct markets. Let's see how we're doing. Marshall and Sarah Marie are drawn on the top. Next. Moral hazard is when having insurance against an event makes you what? Less careful? More careful? It makes you experience it anyway? Or it makes you immune to the thing? What is moral hazard? Need one more person to answer. There we go. Everyone got it right. Excellent. So you all know what moral hazard is. TJ is ahead. The car dealer knows if a car is good or bad, but the buyer doesn't. This is an example of, is it moral hazard? Is it adverse selection? Is it direct finance, or is it primary finance? Very good. Almost all of you got it right. And next, which of these is true for most borrowers? Do we borrow mostly in direct markets? Do we often need banks or other intermediaries? Can we borrow easily using shares? And do we rarely need collateral when we're trying to borrow? Excellent. Very good. TJ still just ahead. Almost at the end. A troubled company so large the government feels pressure to support it. Is it moral hazard? Is it adverse selection? Is it direct markets? Or is it secondary markets? Two people thinking their answers, one person thinking their answer. Very good. Ooh, Sarah Marie's just edged ahead. And last question, you work hard on your homework, your friend copies it and gets an A. This is moral hazard, the free rider problem, the free lunch problem, or the free download problem. Very good. So let's see, how did we do? Third place, we have Sarah Marie. Second place, Marshall. And first place is TJ. All right. Okay, TJ, now you get to choose a silly Snapchat filter to put on me. What would you like to use?
Should I do like the dog one? I don't know.
Dog?
Dog.
What I get with like there's dog face. Is that it?
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
No problem at all. I look better that way anyway. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. And well, take care. And I'll see you, I guess not next week, thanks to the presidential inauguration and Martin Luther King Day. So it'll have to wait until after that. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
Professor. You have a great day.
You too. Take care, and don't forget to give me feedback in case there are any problems. If there's anything I can do to improve the class or improve the interface. Thank you.